I call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 121 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. This meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to standing orders. Before we proceed, I want to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognise you by name before speaking. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. Please address all comments through the chair. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted on Monday, September 16, 2024, the committee is resuming its study of the impact of the reopening of the cod fishery on Newfoundland and Labrador and Quebec. Welcome to our witnesses. We have on Zoom from FFAW Unifor, Don Street, Inshore Member Representative of Area 3PS and President-elect. And as well, we have Dr. Aaron Carruthers, Senior Fisheries Scientist from FFAW. On Zoom as well, we have Dr. George Rose, Honorary Professor, Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries, University of British Columbia. And of course, in the room, we have the Honourable Jerry Byrne, Minister of Fisheries, Forestry and Agriculture for the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador. Thank you for taking the time to appear. You will each have 5 minutes or less for opening statements. I believe that the FFAW will deliver 2 opening remarks, one from Ms. Street and one from Ms. Carruthers. All right, so Ms. Street, you can go first if you're ready, 5 minutes or less.
Mr. Chair, honourable members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to address you today regarding the northern cod commercial fishery. I'm here today representing over 13,000 commercial fish harvesters and processing plant workers. I thank the committee for highlighting the urgent nature of the northern cod decision and the fact that the June decision made by current Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, Minister Diane Leboutillier, threatens the continued rebuilding of our historic cod stock, as well as the continued economic sustainability of coastal Newfoundland and Labrador. For over 500 years, northern cod has been the lifeblood of our coastal communities. Our union is deeply invested in the sustainable management and future viability of this critical resource. And since the moratorium in 1992, our members have worked tirelessly as stewards of this stock through collaborative science initiatives, a commitment to sustainable fishing practices, and participation in the stewardship fishery. We have seen the spawning stock biomass grow from less than 10,000 tons to nearly 400,000 tons today, and that's a remarkable 40-fold increase. This growth has allowed the stock to move from the critical to the cautious zone in 2024. And while this is certainly positive news, we must not repeat the mistakes of the past. And the decision to reopen the commercial fishery with a 6% allocation to offshore draggers is deeply concerning. It threatens to undermine decades of rebuilding efforts. So let me be clear that FFAW Unifor vehemently opposes any offshore trawling activity on this stock. Targeting dense pre-spawning and spawning aggregations during winter months, it poses an unacceptable risk to continued recovery. And our position on access and allocation, of course, remains unchanged. We stand firm in our conviction that the first 115,000 metric tons of northern cod must be exclusively allocated to the inshore sector and Indigenous groups of our province. And this is not merely our position, but a long-standing commitment of the federal government, evidenced in the briefing note provided to your honourable members. This commitment dates to the late 1970s. It's been consistently upheld by successive governments. It recognizes the critical importance of the northern cod fishery to our coastal communities and to the inshore fleet's reliance on this adjacent resource. The commitment also recognizes the crisis that resulted from the moratorium, the voices of inshore harvesters that were ignored in the years leading to the collapse, and the hundreds of communities in our province that were left irreparably devastated by the consequences. The inshore sector has demonstrated tremendous capacity to harvest northern cod. In 2023, our members landed 70% of the 12,999 ton maximum allowable harvest in just 4 weeks. This was achieved while adhering to stringent conservation measures and weekly landing limits. From 2023 to 2024, the total allowable catch for northern cod increased by 6,000 tons. Yet our inshore members received just 2,000 tons of this increase. These are the same harvesters that have acted as stewards of this resource for the last 32 years. To see the status of northern cod move from the critical to cautious zone it's a result of their hard work and their dedication. Seeing a return to the dragger fishery, it's a slap in the face to our inshore harvesters, our plant workers, and it's a symbol of great disconnect between the sitting government and the people of Newfoundland and Labrador. Introducing new offshore capacity is unnecessary and harmful to the economic sustainability of our owner-operator fleet and to the land-based processing workers. This season, we harvested 75% of the inshore allocation in 4 weeks. Our harvesters have the capacity to land a significant volume of high-quality fish, providing frozen product year-round without targeting these vulnerable spawning aggregations. We urge this committee to recognize the economic importance of this fishery. Owner-operator harvesters are genuinely stewards of the resource. They take the long-term sustainability of this fishery very seriously, having lived through the moratorium. They've invested heavily in sustainable gear, quality handling techniques, and have participated in a fisheries improvement project that recently received an A rating from international NGOs. As we look into the future, we call on government to take several critical actions. Firstly, immediately revert the management plan for 2J3KL Northern Cod to a stewardship fishery model, rescind access of domestic and international offshore dragger fleets. Uphold the 115,000 metric ton commitment for exclusive priority allocation to Newfoundland and Labrador inshore harvesters and Indigenous groups, until which time the stock has sufficiently rebuilt. Formalize a system of harvester participation and input into all aspects of fisheries management for Northern Cod. So in closing, I want to emphasize that the decisions made regarding Northern Cod and the management will have far-reaching implications for coastal Newfoundland and Labrador. Our communities, which have existed for centuries because of this fishery, are counting on responsible, sustainable management of this resource. The future of Northern Cod is inextricably linked to the future of our coastal communities. We urge the committee, recommend management measures that recognize this reality and support the long-term sustainability of both the resource and the people who depend on it. Also, Minister Laboutier's parallel decision to allocate the majority of the Unit 1 redfish fishery to the corporate dragger fleet has left our Gulf of St. Lawrence community-based inshore fleet struggling to survive. And to add insult to injury, current management rules mean they cannot even access the small bit of quota they do have. We therefore urge DFO to adjust the minimum fishing depth to align with the current location of the redfish stocks. This will allow our harvesters to access this very time-sensitive fishery. We've learned hard lessons from the 1992 collapse of Northern Cod, and now is the time to apply these lessons, prioritize the adjacent inshore fleet, and ensure that the benefits of stock recovery flow to those who most depend on the resource. We cannot repeat the mistakes of the past. We cannot let the voices of fish harvesters be ignored all over again. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you. A little bit over. We'll try and make that up now with Dr. Cuthers for 5 minutes or less, please.
Okay, thank you for taking the time to hear from the Fish, Food and Allied Workers Union on this important issue. As the fisheries scientist with the FFAW, I will focus my remarks on lessons learned and lessons forgotten from the collapse of the Northern Cod fishery in the 1980s and 1990s, and will also comment on our concerns with how the federal government chose to end the cod moratorium. What I'm going to do here is step through some of the research around the Northern Cod collapse and why it matters. So it's been over 30 years since the collapse of the Northern Cod fishery, and yet the timing and explanations for the collapse remain contentious. When the Northern Cod assessment model was developed, it included extremely high natural mortality between 1992 and 1994, and subsequent variations of the Northern Cod assessment model, including the one used in the 2024 assessment, all attribute the collapse to an unknown natural mortality event. Now, for those folks who are not at stock assessment meetings on the regular, at its most basic, a stock assessment model tracks recruitment, growth, and death in a fish stock. There are only two ways to kill a fish in an assessment model. It's either attributed to fishing as fishing mortality, or it's everything else, which is that grab bag of a natural mortality. That includes unaccounted for fishing mortality, discarding, as well as everything else. So in the official DFO stock assessment version of events, something unknown knocked out millions of fish in the early 1990s. The loss of capelin can explain some of that collapse, but not much. However, the DFO stock assessment is not the only peer-reviewed and published account of the stock collapse. Academic research from the mid-1990s onward showed sequential decline in fishery catch rates of inshore gillnet fisheries in the early 1980s, midshore and offshore gillnet fisheries in the late 1980s, and then from the Canadian trawler fleet in the late 1980s as well. Research papers from the mid-1990s showed that offshore catch rates declined first in the north and that these Canadian draggers were fishing on pre-spawning and spawning aggregations. Multiple research papers on the collapse of northern cod showed that northern cod became increasingly concentrated, shifted south, and were distributed deeper throughout the 1980s and 1990s. And these changes contribute to, number one, increased vulnerabilities, particularly to offshore dragger fleets, and number two, contributed to overestimation of stock health. The term hyperstability was coined by Dr. George Rose and Dave Kulka, and it was used to describe how fishing fleets can maintain high catch rates even during stock collapse. This happened with northern cod. That particular paper has been cited over 400 times, and that metric, I say that metric to indicate that these issues are well known within the fisheries science community. More than 30 years later, there is still no agreement on how, why, when, and importantly, where northern cod collapsed. But one of the lessons that we could have and should have learned was that changes in fish distribution matter. Northern cod is a stock complex. This means that codfish are not evenly distributed throughout Newfoundland and Labrador waters. There are multiple distinct spawning areas, and most fish annually migrate between particular offshore spawning areas and inshore spawning areas. Updated information and research on these questions, on these linkages, is fundamental for rebuilding a sustainable fishery. One of the reasons why I object to the reopening of the trawler fishery is that there has been no recent work on cod distribution, recovery, and vulnerability during the winter and pre-spawning and spawning period. The most recent acoustic survey of spawning aggregations occurred in 2015. Which pre-spawning and spawning aggregations are recovering and which are not? We don't know. I expect that recovery is not evenly distributed across historic spawning areas, and I expect that in part because the recovery of the fishery is uneven in the inshore. With much improved catch rates from the Inshore Sentinel survey in the north in 2J and northern 3K, but no increase at all in southern 3L. Historically, these different inshore fishing grounds were linked to particular offshore spawning areas. Is the recovery that we're seeing now reliant on one or two spawning areas? None of these questions were reviewed at stock assessments prior to the minister's decision. Why did the minister reopen the northern cod fishery to Canadian and international bottom trawl fleets without doing due diligence and assessing stock distribution and vulnerability during the winter and spawning period? Due diligence and a lesson learned would have meant research and review of up-to-date acoustic tagging data and linkages between feeding and spawning areas. It would have meant identification, documentation, and importantly, conservation of spawning aggregations. The motion also included...
I'm going to have to cut you off there, Dr. Crothers. We're gone over time, and I want to get other people to have a chance to speak and get to questions. We'll now go to Dr. Rose for 5 minutes or less, please. You're on mute.
Yeah, excuse me, sorry. Yeah, I'll start over again. There's several aspects to the decision of the minister to reopen a commercial fishery in the northern cod stock. With increased quota and new entrants, I'm only going to deal with the scientific information on the stock and advance my opinion that the decision does not provide for precautionary management and sustainable fisheries and opposes the spirit, if not the letter, of the stock provisions of the Fisheries Act. To go back a bit, the door was reopened for a commercial fishery in the fall of 2023 when DFO Science conducted a new analysis of the productivity of the stock, which resulted in a revised stock recruitment relationship and a lowering of the critical limit reference point, the LRP I'll refer to. They based this on age zero recruitment, which is very unusual in fisheries science and hasn't really been tested. This LRP then is the dividing line between a stock being in critical condition with its ability to sustain itself seriously impaired and a cautious zone where the stock is still below, and in the case of the northern cod, well below its historical abundance and productivity and below any target biomass or upper limit where productivity is not considered to be impaired. That's still undefined for the northern cod by science. It's very important to emphasize that despite being moved into the cautious zone, the stock itself did not grow into the cautious zone, or as at least some press that I read inferred, but simply that the bar to jump over the line into the cautious zone had been lowered. It's also important to emphasize that the lowering of the LRP was substantial. Historically, it was considered the stock needed at least 1 million tons of spawning biomass to remain productive as it was historically. And as recently as 2023, the LRP was considered by DFO and by other scientific analyses, including some done myself and colleagues, to exceed 800,000 tons. The new LRP reduces it to somewhat above 300,000 tons. So this rewrites science history, and this is a very important aspect of it. The lowering of this LRP suggested that the stock had been in the cautious zone since 2016 with production, and this basically means reproductive success recruitment, that it wasn't seriously impaired. The evidence to date, however, indicates that recruitment has been well below historical averages for all of the 7 to 8 years since then. This provides very little evidence that this LRP is justified. It's reasonable to think that if productivity was not seriously impaired, as it's supposed to be now, at least 1 or 2 years of historically average recruitment would have occurred in the past 7 or 8 years, but it has not. So while I applaud DFO Science for their investigations and research, I will remain skeptical about this new lowered and unverified LRP until there's evidence that the stock can be as productive for fisheries, not age zeros, with such a low spawning biomass. I think it too soon. This is my opinion. I think it too soon to use it to determine management. So what about the stock itself? Since 2016, when according to the LRP, the stock has been out of the critical zone, the impacts of the lack of strong recruitment, fishing removals, and unspecified natural mortality that Dr. Carruthers referred to have led the stock to having zero net productivity, with some years negative and a flatlined biomass with no improvement in sight, according to the latest stock assessment. My assumption in approaching this is that a management objective is stock growth, and it's axiomatic that stock growth requires positive net productivity. As it stands, the current stock assessment indicates that the stock is in a very weak position for growth, even with no fishing, and projections suggest further decline. It seems clear that the assumed management objective has not been met, stock growth. To be fair, stock growth is dependent on several factors in the environment, which are not now favorable, especially the lack of capelin, the main food of the northern cod. But management does control fishing removals, and up until this year and this recent decision has done an admirable job of keeping those removals low enough so as not to result in stock decline, even when environmental conditions were poor. Maybe that's the best we can do right now, but we're not doing our best. The present decision to increase the quota considerably by nearly 50% and to impose 2 new entrants in the offshore increases the likelihood of stock decline. even to the extent of collapsing the spawning biomass back below the new LRP. From the DFO latest assessment, the probability of doing this is worryingly high, 42% with no fishery, 52% with a doubled harvest. According to the stock provisions...
Dr. Rose, I have to cut you off there. You're going over by over a minute, and I want to get to the last speaker before we run out of time.
All right.
We'll now go to Minister Byrne for 6 minutes, 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and distinguished members. I would like to acknowledge with appreciation my co-panelists appearing today as witnesses. It is a sincere pleasure for me to return to this table. This time, however, it will be at the other end of the committee room. As some of you may know, I had the privilege of serving in the House of Commons Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans for several years, and I believe we did important work back then, as you continue to do now. I have been witness to every aspect of the rise and the fall of our northern cod resource, as well as the pain and suffering surrounding its slow and difficult rebuilding. In 1994, as a much younger man, I was asked to serve as the special advisor to the then Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. This was just after the two-year moratorium had been already declared by then Minister John Crosbie in 1992. In 1994, the two-year moratorium became a moratorium of indefinite duration. In 1996, I was honoured to be asked to serve in public life as the Member of Parliament for Humber St. Barbe Bay Vert. I served in the House for just shy of 20 years, including in the cabinet of Mr. Chrétien. In 2015, for some of the very reasons we sit together today at this table, I took a decision to seek office in the provincial legislature and currently serve as Minister of Fisheries. Prior to my parliamentary career, I worked briefly in marine ecosystem research in northern Newfoundland, having trained at Dalhousie University. My perspectives of the past failures and the ongoing failures of northern cod management are both professional and personal. In these difficult times, the one thing I believe that we, the people of Newfoundland and Labrador, need to be able to rely on is that this committee will serve the interests of a better fishery and a better future for those who have been waiting in hope for its return. Now is not the time for partisan loyalties or entrenchments. In my time here, if there was one committee on Parliament Hill that rightfully cultivated the reputation of being beyond politics and in service to our coastal communities, it is indeed this committee. I can't ever remember any member of this committee looking to join so that they could be a shill for their party, nor can I remember any dissenting minority reports being the norm as it is with other committees. This committee always came together to speak truth to power. Keep hold of that. With that said, it was disturbing to have learned through internal DFO documents that the 32-year moratorium was somehow over by virtue of a switch of a single word and in defiance of science advice. The legal and political consequences of relying on a single word, commercial over sentinel, to generate a false hope is offensive. Talking points don't change 32 years of loss or the anxiety of cultural separation or the economic and social upheaval that this brings forth. It doesn't change the past, but unfortunately that single word, we have discovered, it does have a material effect on our future. For anybody to think that the decisions around the 2024 harvesting plan, or CHP, for northern cod would result in street parades or songs and poems being written in celebration that the weight of the past 32 years has been somehow lifted, that exposes the fact that the magnitude of this decision was never understood by DFO. It wasn't understood in 1992 and clearly still isn't understood to this day. There was no political win deserving to anyone here. The only political win that can ever be created is from a fishery that has been honestly rebuilt on a foundation of sustainability, with windows and doors to allow transparency, and a protective roof made up of informed decision-making with fishermen and scientists working together towards an informed joint decision-making process. This is the kind of house we need to build to have a future. This was and is too much for Newfoundland and Labrador to ask, apparently. I don't know exactly what to say to that, but over the next 90 minutes, if you were to ask me what I knew about the long-standing Government of Canada's allocation policy of the first 115,000 metric tons of harvestable quota, I will tell you. If you were to ask me what has been the long-standing position of the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador on the inshore-offshore allocation split, I will tell you. If you were to ask me what I think of the supposed necessity for Canada having no choice but to recognize the fishery as being commercial with all of its legal implications within NAFO, I will tell you why this was untrue and defeatist. If you were to ask me what I feel about the risks of foreign distant water fishing fleets, foreign bottoms entering the fishery under the current NAFO convention and its system of voluntary rule, I will tell you what I think there. And if you were to ask me if there are other Atlantic fisheries that demonstrate just or even more clearly how far off track DFO is from understanding the past and learning from it to make better conservation decisions in the future, I will point directly to what is happening today with redfish in Unit 1, Gulf of St. Lawrence. But most importantly, if you were to ask me how all of this was able to occur in such a vacuum here in Ottawa, with no one offering honest, pragmatic advice to the Emperor about the clothes they think they are fashioning, I will tell you. Time now for truth to power. I will explain why joint management's time has come. Mr. Chair, I look forward to the questions to come forward.
For that, we'll now begin our rounds of questions. Remind members, please identify who you're asking the question to, because we have members on Zoom and somebody in the room. So I'll go to Mr. Small first for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the witnesses for showing up at this very important study. Mr. Chair, my first question here goes to Mr. Rose, who's the preeminent expert on northern cod biology, for sure. Mr. Rose, you made mention of the lowering of the lower reference point back in October of last year. Do you think that was a part of the what a lot of people are calling a political decision? Do you think that that was a part of the political equation for reopening of the commercial northern cod fishery?
Well, I can't really speak to that other than to hope certainly not. I think it was a result of investigative science that was perhaps, pushed a little bit too hard into the management regime. But I won't, question the ethics of my scientific colleagues on that.
We had officials here at this committee a couple days ago who told us that data going back to 1954 had been pulled in to change the reference point on that cod stock. In that same meeting, these officials talked about how important the data, the logbook data was that was coming back from fishermen in the northern cod stewardship fishery. Yet, an order paper question that I submitted in last October that came back in December revealed that the logbook data from 2020, 2021, and 2022 had been still on the shelf. So does the fact that that logbook data had been sitting there for 3 years indicate that that data was valuable to DFO? Thank you. Mr. Rose.
There are several issues with the new stock assessment and the lowering of the LRP that I'm aware of. That may be one, but there are others. I have just had an opportunity now to read the stock status report, which just came out days ago, to see some of the details of how they arrived at these new calculations. I still remain, as I say, skeptical about them and about how this was put together. And I think the general statement here that needs to be thought about really clearly is that this new modeling approach and the lowering of the LRP, it rewrites the scientific history of this stock going back 50 years. It goes back to some of the most well-known Newfoundland fishery scientists, right back to Wilfred Templeman, and their analyses and opinions and data on this stock. It rewrites most of that, as does the current assessment model. So my view of this right now, it's not to dismiss the new model or say, I know absolutely that it's incorrect, but I'm skeptical about such a rapid rewriting of scientific history on this stock, and seems to be unquestioned that, here we are, we've got a brand new world, and we're supposed to accept this. Well, science doesn't work that way. Science remains skeptical until there is convincing evidence that the new...
Thank you, Mr. Rose. So my time's limited here. But my question was, bringing in data from 1954 and bringing that into this equation where data that was only 3-4 years old was sitting on the shelf and not made a part of the equation. Does that make sense to you, Mr. Rose?
Well, no, just stated like that, it doesn't, but I don't know the details of that data, so I can't, really say with any certainty.
Well, it's fish harvesters logbook data, Mr. Rose, that show catch rates are about 50 times higher per unit per hour than they were in the 80s, at least. So you've had extensive experience at the NAFO table, I understand. Is that correct?
No, it's not.
Oh, okay. I was misled, sorry. But in your experience with NAFO, Mr. Rose, I know you're very aware of NAFO. Do you think that Canada was facing pressure to change this fishery from a stewardship fishery to a commercial fishery? Do you think there was undue pressure from NAFO to do so?
Not that I'm aware of.
Thank you. So what would you like to see changed?
I'm going to have to cut you off there, Mr. Small. You've
So
got 9 seconds left, so
I
you
got
won't get a
9, Jerry
question
got
in or an answer.
Minute and 20 more.
We'll now go to Ms. Jones, and welcome to the committee. 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's a pleasure to be here at committee today. I want to first welcome Dr. Rose and say it's nice to see you again, sir. Also congratulate Ms. Street on her recent election to the FFAW and welcome Minister Byrne back to committee in a different capacity. I think for me, I've been involved in this fishery like most people in Newfoundland and Labrador in one way, shape, or form all my life. My family comes from the fishing industry of northern cod. From 1992 to 1996, I worked as an employment counselor with fishers and plant workers who were displaced from the closure of northern cod, and eventually served in provincial politics and as a Minister of Fisheries in Newfoundland and Labrador. So from my perspective, I look at this for what it is. Since 2016, cod in Newfoundland Labrador have been outside of the critical designation and has been there. Over that period of time, we've had tremendous lobby, not from NAFO, but from fishers in Newfoundland and Labrador, from the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, from the FFAW, from the offshore, from Mr. Small, to reopen the cod fishery at a TAC no less than 25,000 metric tons. What the minister did was reopen it at 18,000 metric tons, 7,000 metric tons lower than any of those people requested.
1 second, Ms. Jones. We got a point of order from Mr. Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my point of order is regarding Ms. Jones' comment that I asked for a reopening. I asked simply for an increase in the quota. Made no reference to any reopening, simply an increase to the quota under the stewardship framework. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Thank you. I hope that doesn't come off my time, Mr. Chair, but I have a copy of the letter by Mr. Small. It's already been tabled in committee. It does not speak to maintaining a stewardship fishery. It speaks to increasing the total allowable catch for northern cod in Newfoundland and Labrador. And those are letters that were written by fishers, by the MP, 3 letters from the government of Newfoundland and Labrador to the federal government asking that that happen, including many members of the FFAW. So I'm going to go to Ms. Street first in my questioning. In moving from a stewardship fishery to a commercial fishery in Newfoundland and Labrador, it allowed many of your members in the Labrador region to obtain a Labrador northern cod quota for the first time in their history. It allowed them to have access to this resource that they could not have access to under a stewardship fishery. And I ask you, as the head of the union, do you support those fishers who wanted that done in Labrador and wanted that quota?
Thank you. We certainly support harvesters in Labrador, and I want to be clear here.
Thank you
When
very much. I
we-
appreciate your
when we,
response.
um,
I'd like to now
when we
go to
support-
Minister Byrne, please. I'd like to ask you, Minister Byrne. I'm sorry, I'm on limited time here. I want to go to you, Mr. Byrne. Do you support the fishers in Labrador that the inshore harvesters there should finally get access to northern cod adjacent to their communities and have access to that quota as a commercial fishery, or do you hold the position that they should not have?
Mr. Chair, I'm somewhat at a loss to the somewhat passive-aggressive nature to the question in that.
Well, let me explain
naturally,
it to
we
you
are in
for just a
support
moment.
Of inshore fishers from Labrador.
Let me explain
I
it
don't
to you
understand
for
where that
just a
question would
minute.
come from.
As a stewardship fishery, the people of Labrador, for the last 4 years, the inshore fishers could not access their own quota in Labrador and have a commercial-led fishery. In order to do that, for them to have their own quota, we had to move it to the next stage, a commercial fishery. We did so by increasing the TAC from 12,000 ton to 18,000 ton. Do you agree that Labrador inshore fishermen should have access to the northern cod stock?
Mr. Chair, the premise of the question is flawed. The designation of a commercial fishery versus a sentinel fishery is not.
It was
vested
not a
in any
sentinel
kind of-
fishery, Mr. Chair. It was a stewardship fishery. And my question is very clear. Under the stewardship fishery, for 4 years, they were rejected. I am asking you today, do you agree with Labradorians having access to fish stocks adjacent to their shores under a commercial fishery?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe the premise to the question is that in order to get additional quota, there would have to be a required move to a commercial fishery, that there would be a threshold to which from the test fishery, from the science fishery, to move to that additional quota, it automatically implied the designation of a commercial status. There is no evidence whatsoever to support that in either a fisheries term nor in a legal term. It is a semantic, in other words.
In fact, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, I want to outline for the minister that the only way that that could be done was moving to a commercial fishery. The other thing I'd like to ask you, Minister, do you support the 3 Indigenous groups in Labrador having access to northern cod under a commercial offshore fishery adjacent to their shores, or should they have been left out again from this allocation?
So, Mr. Chair, I believe a straw man argument is being set up here. This is a requirement. The notion that there is a legal or binding scientific element to the designation of a commercial fishery versus a science-based fishery, I am not aware of any such terminology or designation which insists on
Mr. Chair,
the
the
deployment of such a
minister is
term.
not aware, so let me move on. Let me ask the head of the union, because if the minister is not aware, I ask the head of the union, do you not support an offshore northern cod fishery in Labrador that allows access for the Innu Nation, the Nunatsiavut government and Nunatuavut, because that's what you're telling us here today. That's what the minister have told us here today.
Mr. Chair, we support the upholding of the first 115,000 metric tons going to inshore and Indigenous interests. We believe, as has been proven, that those Indigenous allocations can be harvested by inshore harvesters, not necessarily requiring mobile gear.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. We'll now go to Madam Debienne for
Chair.
6 minutes or less, please.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Mr. Cormier.
I'm not sure if I was the only one, and maybe the other witnesses, but I was not able to see Minister Byrne when he was talking. I'm not sure if I was the only one, but I was not able to see him on the screen when he was responding to the question of Ms. Jones.
Okay, thank you for pointing that out, Mr. Cormier. Madam Debienne, 6 minutes or
but
less.
Mr. Chair, like seriously, like what we're supposed to see the witnesses when they answer question. I was not able to see the witnesses. I think Ms. Barron also was not able to see the witnesses respond. I'm not sure if other, but we're not able to see the witnesses respond to question.
Okay, did we see them when they gave their opening remarks?
Yes, but not now.
Not now,
We're
okay.
supposed to have, access to the witnesses when they answer question also.
All
So
right.
I think Ms. Barron is agreeing with me on that also, so.
Yeah, I see her head shaking up and down in the affirmative manner. Okay, so we'll take a very short pause and see if we can straighten this out. Thank you. Madam Debienne, when you're ready, please. 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to our witnesses. You always make very insightful and interesting remarks here, important for our work here at the committee. I have a bit more of a local question. I saw my father crying in his ship.
Rappel au règlement, Monsieur le Président, je suis désolé.
You can't see me, you can't hear me.
Mr. Chair, and apologies to Madame Dambier for interrupting. It was just the microphone wasn't on, so we weren't able to hear the beginning of what Madame Desbiens was saying.
Eh oui, pourtant.
And yet my microphone was on, says Madame Desbiens. So should I restart? I'd like to thank the witnesses for their attendance here. I'd like to give a bit of background, personal background. Mine is more local in character, I would say, because I saw my father crying in his boat because one day he said, take advantage of the cod now because one day you won't have any left to eat because if we stop the seal hunt, there will be no, if we don't stop the seal hunt, there'll be no, if we stop the seal hunt, there won't be any cod left in the St. Lawrence. We're really at a turning point where we're reopening, we're eliminating a moratorium that really shook up the range of livelihoods of fish harvesters and workers many years ago for northern cod. And as with redfish, we're giving over important shares of this resources to trawlers, to offshore trawlers. We learned in the past that this was a technique that was very aggressive, very harsh on the biomass, which had the consequences which we're familiar with today. And I don't think we don't learn the lessons of the past. We haven't learned from past experiences. I'd like to ask the minister who's here with us today, I'd like to know if you draw a certain link or connection between the recent redfish quota, the historic share that have been given to offshore harvesters, and the fact that offshore harvesters are being brought back in for northern cod. Are the dangers the same? Is this kind of we hear about this illogical approach we hear about on the ground? Can these two fish stocks be compared?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for this question. I think it does have immediacy and value to the study of northern cod, because realistically what we face in 2024, this calendar year, this fishing season, are the opening of two very iconic groundfish fisheries. Not only northern cod, which was under moratorium since 1992, 32 years in total, but Redfish Unit 1 has been in moratorium since 1995. Last year, the total allowable catch of redfish in Unit 1 was 4,500 tons. This year it is 60,000. At its peak in the 1960s, the total allowable catch of redfish in Unit 1 was not far off 60,000 tons. To go to that magnitude in one single year, having faced the moratorium of just about 30 years, I am challenged to understand the sensibility of that particular position. But notwithstanding that, realistically what we need to do is examine, have we learned anything in 30 years? Has the Department of Fisheries and Oceans learned anything in 30 years of moratoria? Well, one would say that the cause of the northern cod collapse, the cause of redfish collapse, was indeed because too many too many fishermen were chasing too few fish with too many plants. There was too much capacity. There was irresponsible demands on the resource created by politics. Everything from the resource short plant program to the advanced investments, monetary investments, public investments in infrastructure. Redfish is unique because at the time of its reopening, 30 years later, very little infrastructure existed in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. There was infrastructure on the west coast of Newfoundland where there was a viable redfish fishery that existed. There were plants. There are boats in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, inshore boats with mobile otter trawl gear capable of fishing redfish. What was the answer to the Government of Canada? Did they say, we are going to control capacity, we're going to control the number of boats, we're going to control the ability to be able to fish this, we're going to make sure that the quotas are set at reasonable amounts, incremental amounts, that we can monitor and gauge the activity. We're going to allow our fishermen who go fishing a reasonably efficient and economically effective way to fish it? None of the above were followed. None. The Government of Canada actually, in this day, in the 21st century, for the Government of Canada to say, we don't have enough plants in some locations, we don't have enough fishermen in some locations, we don't have enough boats in some locations, we have no way to market this fish except for the few that have the ability to do this in Western Newfoundland and Southern Labrador. What we're going to do is let's allow more fishermen into the fishery, let's allow more plants into the fishery, let's get everybody involved, and let's spend government money to do it, while at the same time, those who engaged in the sentinel in the test fisheries and the science fisheries are now restricted from ever being able to reasonably catch any of that redfish. Mr. Chair, the best check to ever write is the one you think you'll never get cashed. And that's what the Government of Canada has done.
Thank you, Mme. Debienne. There's only 7 seconds left. You're not going to get a question out, let alone get an answer. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. I wish I were there in person with you. This is an exciting day for me to be lighthearted for a moment. This is the first time I've been surrounded by this many Newfoundlanders and Labradorians outside of Newfoundland and Labrador since my last family reunion. So this is exciting for me to be amongst all of you. You know, I say it every single meeting because how can I not? But I want to reiterate how important this is. We know that this isn't just about fishers and their livelihoods. We know this isn't just about marine ecosystems and protecting stocks, but also around the coastal communities that rely on the industry. My family moved from St. John's, Newfoundland to the West Coast as a result of the cod moratorium. So I know firsthand the real implications on families, even if they are not fishers. First and foremost, I wanted to offer the opportunity to, through the chair to you, Ms. Street, to be able to both finish your opening comments and also to be able to respond to the question that was asked to you by Ms. Jones, to be able to more fully answer that question.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, what I had been trying to say was that, yes, we absolutely support Indigenous groups having allocations and having access to the stock. And as I said, when I finished, but we don't necessarily feel that mobile bottom trawlers are necessary to get that fish out of the water. Many of our members in Labrador are Indigenous, of course, and fish northern cod, and certainly do not support bottom trawling. So I think the issue here is the Liberal government's failure to uphold its promise on the first 115,000 metric tons of northern cod being allocated to our members in the inshore and to Indigenous groups. So yes, we obviously do support Indigenous groups having access.
Thank you, Ms. Street. Did you want to finish any of your opening statements, or do you feel that that has come out already in the answers that you've provided?
I was one of the only ones lucky enough to finish my opening remarks.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
It was Dr. Carruthers who didn't finish. That's right. Thank you. Ms. Street, in your opening statement, you had mentioned, you said owner-operator harvesters are genuine stewards of the resource, and they take the long-term sustainability of their fishery very seriously, having lived through the moratorium. They have invested heavily in sustainable gear, quality handling techniques, and participated in a fishery improvement project that recently received an A rating from international NGOs. Can you expand on that a little bit and tell us a little bit more about those comments that you made?
Sure. So out of the moratorium, here at FFAW, we have a harvester-led science program, and I'm sure Dr. Carruthers can also speak more detailed on it, and it is Sentinel fishery, and it's harvester-led. It's been providing data input into stock assessment since the moratorium, and that program has been very, very important to harvesters. As we move forward and the stock did move into a much healthier zone, even though it was still in the critical zone, we did see the TAC increase and realized, the markets we had in the 80s and 90s weren't necessarily there right now. So at FFAW, we worked with a number of processors to ensure that handling on vessels was producing the highest quality cod we could, and developed a set of protocols and ran a program for, I think it was 5 years, where harvesters in all areas harvested their fish. They had a separate allocation and utilized these protocols to ensure that their fish was top quality. So we've been doing everything we can in that regard. And the Fisheries Improvement Project, we actually started that in 2016, I believe. And again, Dr. Carruthers can correct me on that. And I was lead on that project for quite some time in my days in the science program here at FFAW. And we did a lot of work. And again, the quality program, the handling, working with plants on MSC certification, what it would take for our fish to be MSC certified and to be able to take advantage of those markets once we did have a TAC that was sufficient to land fish more year round. Because of course, in the 2000s, when we did have a very limited TAC, it was coming in pretty much, in a few weeks the fishery was over. What we've been able to do in instituting a series of weekly limits and management measures is to spread that fish out. We usually open late July, early August, and run into a fall fishery that right now is just about to close. So
Thank you.
We've been able to spread that out for the market.
Great. Thanks. Thank you, Ms. Street. I only have about a minute left, but I want to ask Dr. Carruthers if there's any final comments that you wanted to make, because I know you were the one that got cut off, but also I was hoping that you can expand on, in your opening statement, you talked about the dense pre-spawning and spawning aggregations during winter months and the activity of large offshore draggers. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit further on the implications of that.
So when fish are during the winter period and when they're in pre-spawning and spawning aggregations, they are aggregated really tightly together. And one of the things that's heartbreaking about this reopening of the fishery is that if you go through the 1990s and 2000s papers of fisheries science, you can actually see the fish stock collapse. You can see that in the 80s, there are distributions along the shelf edge. And then sequentially, each year, the number of aggregations drops out until it winks out to nothing. There are multiple papers that were published in the 1990s and early 2000s that show this sequential collapse. So it's quite shocking that we aren't considering the spatial distribution, because it is evidence, and there was some truly excellent fishery science that came out of the cod collapse. Just the other thing that I wanted to comment on with the time is that in our fishery improvement project, it's a comprehensive improvement project. And so we've been improving the data that's coming in from rec fishery, which is a problem. We have these great line cutters, which means that people can responsibly release leatherbacks and other bycatch to the best possible post-release survival. We have removed tons of old gear that was left on the wharves in southern Labrador as part of our fishery improvement project. So it's a comprehensive one. It is not simply what is the status of the stock, but it's all the components that's going to need to be made a sustainable fishery.
Thank you for that, Ms. Cutters. We'll now go to Mr. Arnold for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to start off with Mr. Burns. Minister, the current fisheries minister was shuffled into her position because the previous minister had a penchant for not listening to Canadian harvesters. The current minister told Canadians, and I was there when she told harvesters, that she would be different and she would listen more. Minister, when federal fisheries minister met with the provincial ministries of the Council of Fisheries and Aquatic Aquaculture ministers this past August, were you and other provincial fisheries ministers heard by the minister? Did she listen to you?
Thank you, Mitch, Mr. Chair. We had a difficult meeting, for sure. It is a matter of public record that there was no communique that resulted from the 2024 Canadian Council of Fisheries and Aquaculture Ministers because there was no consensus on the results of the meeting. It was very, very difficult because there were, and I said this quite openly, publicly, joined by the majority of other ministers that were at the meeting as well. The federal minister attempted to unilaterally set the agenda and would not accept discussion points arising from her federal and provincial counterparts. Mr. Chair, allow me to say that this is not necessarily unique to this minister or to a previous minister. This is a structural impediment by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and its ministers for a very long time. The ability to dialogue, to collaborate, is an absolutely essential component to fisheries management. Those who have big stakes in the game here, they've got big investments, and I'm not just talking financial, I'm talking community, I'm talking cultural, social, economic, financial, historic. We often feel as though that the department is very unilateral in its approach. One of the things, we've had institutions within the management of fisheries resources that allowed greater dialogue and feedback. And I'll give one example. The Fisheries Resource Conservation Council. Coming out of the 1992 moratorium on cod and
I'll
groundfish
ask you
stocks,
to be brief if you could, Minister. I've got
the decision to remove and eliminate the Fisheries Resource Conservation Council in 2007 was an example of yet another example of an administration just simply not listening and not interested in dialogue.
Minister, if your Premier makes an announcement, are you, as a minister, expected to uphold that announcement?
I would think that within the context of the Westminster parliamentary democracy and the cabinet process, I think that would be a reasonably minded expectation of the ministers and cabinet solidarity.
And if you had to counter or go contrary to that announcement by your Premier, would you be expected to explain that to your constituents?
I have the advantage of having a very progressive Premier, that if I took a position that was different than his, I am blessed by the fact that I would, through the presentation of fact, logic, and evidence, my Premier would be prepared to change his mind if there was a cause to change his mind. And I really appreciate the fact that I have a very progressive Premier.
What do you believe was the reason for the federal fisheries minister to make an announcement contradictory to what her prime minister had publicly stated, and we're aware of his 2015 promise?
So, Mr. Chair, if members of the committee would approve, what I'd like to do is answer that question by removing the politics from it and just use fact and evidence. I sat in not this room, but in the committee room back in 2008 when Assistant Deputy Minister David Bevan said to the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans, he said, quote, "That policy was put in place as we made significant decisions. For example, on 2J3KL cod, the first 115,000 tons go to the inshore, and the remainder will be shared between the inshore and the offshore." I'm demonstrating this because it has been a government policy. The second thing that I will note to the committee is that it is not unreasonable for someone to come to the conclusion that the Government of Canada's long-standing policy has been that inshore-offshore split. I'll write, citing the allocation policy for Northern cod that the current Government of Canada articulated as recently as June of 2021 in the 2021 2J3KL Northern cod Stewardship Fishery Management Approach by DFO, and I quote, in that report, "The 2021 management approach also includes a decision to allocate the first 115,000 metric tons of northern cod to the inshore sector and Indigenous groups. When a total allowable catch for northern cod 2J3KL is established, the first 115,000 tons of directed Canadian access will be allocated to the inshore sector and Indigenous groups in Newfoundland and Labrador. At a TAC level that is less than or equal to 115,000
We're going
tons."
way over time. I got to get to Ms. Thompson for 5 minutes or less, please.
Mr. Chair, and I'm so pleased to be able to join this committee today.
It's a big
For me, it's particularly special. My grandfather was a schooner captain in the days of wooden dories going over the side on the Grand Banks, and I have family who are still involved in the fishery. It's a very important conversation. I will say to you what I say consistently is conservation must be at the forefront of our decisions. I think we have an opportunity this year to be able to build on the science that we know has been missing from the Harper days when there were significant cuts to the challenges through the COVID years. And I'm also really pleased to note that we are on target with our marine conservation areas, and I think that's very helpful when we open the 6% allocation to offshore. What I'm struggling with today is the inconsistencies in so much of what I'm hearing. Mr. Small, to you, the letter, which I know has been tabled, I won't read out again, on May 9th to the minister, asking for a larger allocation than was decided on at the end, but also the link to a focus on the economy. Also, in a follow-up note, which I thought was very unscientific. I look forward to hearing from you soon. Otherwise, be prepared for blitz and question period in all media. So, I find that a little bit political and partisan. Within the provincial government, the letters that, again, have been tabled from 2021, 2023, 2024, and, of course, today on allocations, different fisheries ministers and different perspectives. So when we speak to joint management, really, what does that look like when we're seeing such inconsistencies in terms of just the last number of years? Mr. Byrne, the question to you. On the day that the Northern Cod moratorium was reopened, Premier Furey tweeted the following: "Our province has waited a long time for the end of the Northern Cod moratorium. A sustainable harvest that provides maximum benefits for all Newfoundlanders and Labradorians is most important. The return of the Northern Cod fishery will support local jobs and boost the economy." I should note that the tweet remains on his Twitter feed to this day, and a copy will be tabled with the clerk so it can be used as a report writing process. So, Mr. Byrne, the Premier celebrated the news with this tweet because the Minister did more or less exactly as the province asked for in 2021, 2023. And can you tell me, that your stand has been different, but why is the tweet still up to this day?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I don't think anyone should be in the business of cancelling history or revising what has been said. But I think we should all be in the business of putting a context to information and not attempting to weaponize it. 2021, the Government of Canada made a clear, unequivocal statement that the first 115,000 metric tons would indeed be going to exclusively the inshore. In 2022, the Government of Canada said that the 2021 plan would be a rollover of the previous plan. The events that established the 115,000 metric ton threshold have been a 25-year-old history.
Sorry to interrupt, and I truly am sorry to interrupt, but I have limited time. The challenge is that the letters from the former fishery ministers contradict what you're saying. So in terms of management, we have different opinions within a very short period of time. And what I'm trying to understand is, where is the consistency when we talk about being able to co-manage, or an understanding of, from a provincial federal perspective, how you want to move forward with the fishery?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The honourable member is wrong. The context is taken inappropriately. The interpretation is taken inappropriately. We all have a celebration when we, because of hard work, discipline, and stalwart adherence to science, that a quota can come up when we do the necessary stewardship. That is a celebration worth having. But we also recognize, Mr. Chair, and I'll say this, there is a principle amongst all around the table, from the FFAW to the Government of Canada to the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador. If we respect and understand the 115,000 metric ton principle, we acknowledge that there is a future role for the offshore. We all have to say that and say it out loud. There will be a future role for the offshore. But here is the point that is often missed. When NAFO became involved, we are now forced to be in a defensive position. And this was the mistake of allowing NAFO to be able to be engaged in this fishery. Mr. Chair, I'd really appreciate, if I'm going to be asked a question, the opportunity to be able to answer it. Here is where a mistake was made. When NAFO became involved, we automatically became in a defensive position, because if we did not take every pound of fish that was allocated to Canada out of the water, guess who comes looking for it? Russia.
On that note about a time to answer a question or to ask it, the member owns the time. If it goes over and the answer is not given, witnesses are always asked to, could you please provide that in writing? We know you haven't got time to answer it, whatever. So if there's something that any of the witnesses have been asked here today and haven't had a chance to answer or finish answering, they're more than welcome to submit an answer to the clerk, and it will be included in the study. So I'll now move on to Madame Debienne for 2.5 minutes, please, or less.
Thank you, Chair. Once again, I'd like to direct my question to Minister Byrne. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. My English isn't great. What we've learned is that the worst of scenarios is coming true, and we've learned nothing from the past. This is a quote from you, but it's also what I said, and it's also what a number of Quebec fish harvesters have been saying. In Quebec, they're asking for to be listened to better understand what we learn from the front lines. We've left harvesters in a terrible situation, and yet they've provided excellent data, around mackerel, for example. And today you're arguing that we should insist that the federal government should significantly decentralize our decision-making powers of measurement, of guidelines around fisheries. I'd like you to go into some detail on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not only do I say that, but every premier of every province and every territory in Canada, in our federation, including the Premier of Quebec and including the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, all premiers, 13 premiers of our country, of our federation, argue that there should be a decentralized structure. In July of 2024, Premier Dr. Andrew Furey brought forward the matter to the Council of the Federation about joint management, the opportunity for joint management. All premiers of Canada, the 13 premiers, 10 of the provinces, 3 of the territories, agreed that joint management would produce a better result for Canada's marine resources. And that's one of the things that I attempted to bring to the floor at the Canadian Council for Fisheries and Aquaculture Ministers in August of 2024, and was informed by the federal minister at that time, that there shall be no discussions surrounding any conversation and any conclusions made by the Council of the Federation, because that has no place at the Canadian Council for Fisheries and Aquaculture Ministers, and was not allowed to be included in the communique, in the discussion. That, Mr. Chair, I don't think is appropriate behavior, given the nature of our federation. The second thing that I will say is that Newfoundland and Labrador is advancing a very specific request for joint management. That is a healthy proposition, because it allows a better sounding board for important decisions to be made and to be more collegial, more collaborative, and I think better results in the process. If anyone needs to know what happens when DFO does not collaborate, look at season 2024.
Thank you, Mr. Byrne, and thank you, Madame Debienne. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 2.5 minutes, please, or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the witnesses again. My question is to Dr. Rose. Dr. Rose, you had spoken about the lack of precautionary management, and we know how important the precautionary approach is. It's within the Sustainable Fisheries Framework. It's used to ensure conservation and sustainable use of resources. These are things you already know. Can you tell me a little bit more about the lack of precautionary management that you've seen, and what that means for the decisions that are being made around cod stocks?
Well, I would think that until this year, the management that was imposed was precautionary. But the new announcement from the ministry especially introducing 2 new entrants in the offshore is not. Now, you have to realize that the stock itself is at a fraction of it was historically. It hasn't grown in 7 to 8 years. Its net productivity has basically been zero. And even more worrisome, the stock assessment forecasts are that the stock will decline in the coming years, almost no matter what we do, because of just poor environmental conditions for it right now. So really, increasing fisheries right now is rolling the dice on putting this fishery back below the new LRP. And you must realize that we aren't confident that we're above the LRP now. If we look at this statistically, I don't want to get into too much, of that. Everybody will roll their eyes. But statistically, we are not significantly above the LRP right now, as we speak. So imposing new fisheries, increasing quota significantly at this time just doesn't seem to be precautionary to me.
I made the mistake of muting myself. Sorry. Yeah. So I heard everything you said. Thank you, Dr. Rose. And I only have 10 seconds left. So I guess I would love for you to be able to provide in writing a little bit more of an expansion on what you were talking about rewriting science and the implications that can have on the future sustainability of cod if we are using science that is so new and then making management decisions based on that science being rewritten. I would love to be able to better understand that, to be able to utilize for our recommendations that we'll be putting together for the government. But I don't have time to get a response from you right now. But thank you so much.
You're welcome.
You're right, Ms. Byrne. We'll now go to Mr. Small for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for Dr. Carruthers. In 2017, Doctor, there was a study done here in this very friendly committee back in the day, apparently, according to Honourable Jerry Byrne, where recommendation number 7, that Fisheries and Oceans Canada make every effort to control the seal populations through a sustainable and responsible harvest to ensure that the seal populations do not prevent the northern cod stock from replenishing in the future. In this study, in this nonpartisan document right here, all committee document, all party document, now you mentioned that there was some unknown mortality. Do you think that could be from seal predation, Doctor?
So there is an increased seal population in the southern portion of the 2J3KL stock. That is particularly in areas like Renews and stuff like that. So that is true. But the natural mortality spike that I was speaking about was the collapse in 1990, how the current DFO model tries to explain what happened in the collapse between 92 and 94 is what I was trying to articulate with my reference to natural mortality. Sorry, did I answer your question, Mr. Small?
Thank you very much. My next question is to Ms. Street, and congratulations on becoming the incoming president of FFAW Unifor in Newfoundland and Labrador. In our last committee meeting, I don't know if you saw it or not, but we had Assistant Deputy Minister Byrne explain to us that Minister Laboutier could not help the Prime Minister uphold his promise to the inshore for the 115,000 tons, and basically said that the minister decided to turn to go with a commercial fishery because it would provide year-round employment. So we've got a quota set at about 18,000 metric tons here. What do you think of that? Do you think the minister has achieved her goals in providing year-round employment from the northern cod fishery?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Absolutely not. I mean, I said in my opening remarks that 75% of the inshore allocation was landed in 4 weeks this year. And, if we're looking at year-round employment on northern cod, obviously it's very far down the road. Now, employment in Newfoundland and Labrador in the fishery can be year-round, but it's based on a multi-species fishery. And, I did hear Mr. Byrne's comments, and I find any insinuation that we're going to be harvesting on a stock 365 days a year to be very troubling. We even had at NAFO this year Mr. Burns, who was head of the delegation, stressing that we needed a seasonal closure when it came to the offshore, whether that be domestic or international. So to even insinuate that we're going to harvest the stock year-round is problematic. I just look at the 3PS fishery right now. We don't harvest that year-round, even though that is commercial. So I don't think that statement really holds any true weight. And the largest groundfish plant in Newfoundland and Labrador right now, which is Icewater Seafoods, does operate pretty much year-round, and that's on a number of different products and secondary processing. So I don't think it's a valid reason on northern cod.
Thank you, Ms. Reed. I've got right here the NAFO meeting minutes going back to 2020, and did a word search on that, looking for northern cod, and the deputy ministers that were here earlier this week, and the assistant deputy ministers, had insinuated that there had been pressure from NAFO to convert from a stewardship fishery to a commercial fishery. We couldn't really find much of that, any reference to northern cod at all in those NAFO meeting minutes. Are you aware of any pressure, in the last 5 years, like seriously, coming from NAFO to convert this fishery to a commercial fishery so that they could get access? What's your opinion?
Mr. Chair, I don't have any personal knowledge of any pressure at NAFO. I did attend my first NAFO annual meeting this year, and unfortunately the decision had already been made at that point. But what I will say is, if there had been pressure, whether that was on side conversations or in bilats at NAFO, I think it's the duty of the Canadian delegation and the head of DEL to push back and not buckle to that pressure.
Thank you, Mr. Small. We'll now go to Ms. Jones for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, let me clarify that the NAFO agreement has been in place since 1996, and it was negotiated at that time at 5%. It remains that way today. Minister Byrne was an MP for nearly 20 years of that time. That has been the case since 1996. So it's not that NAFO pressured the government and this big story that seems to be trending at the table. So that's the information. The other thing I want to outline here is that I'm sensing no support for the 2 offshore licenses in Newfoundland that gained access, as well as offshore in Labrador, which very much upsets me because I am both professional and personal on this as well. Without that codfish allocation in Labrador, my plants go empty, my people's boats go empty, and that is not fair access. It's adjacent to their shores. But let me say this. We have 3 letters on record from the government of Newfoundland and Labrador stating that they would propose that if we're going to open it up to NAFO, which they know we have to, the agreement's been there for 30 years, that we also open it up to the offshore. The first sign from the government of Newfoundland and Labrador to not go to an offshore fishery came with Minister Byrne came into play. And I have the letters here. The member, Mr. Small, indicated as well that we should increase the northern cod allocation from 12,000 ton to a minimum of 25,000 ton. Now, maybe he doesn't remember that. Maybe Steve Kent wrote those letters for him, the bag man for the Conservative Party, when he had him on 1 or 2 of those contracts he paid him for in Newfoundland and Labrador. But the facts are the facts. Stephen Harper cut the Fisheries Council of Canada. He cut the science in DFO. He got rid of all the scientists. It wasn't important in the fishing industry in Newfoundland and Labrador. My memory is long, I want to say to the member opposite and to the minister. And what we did in Newfoundland and Labrador this year was good news. It was good news to open a commercial cod fishery after 30 years, to let boats on the water and let fish be landed in plants. Let me tell you, the offshore licenses that were granted access to cod are landing cod in Arnold's Cove in Newfoundland. It is being processed in that plant. The boats are owned by Newfoundlanders. Can you confirm that, Minister? They're fished by Newfoundlanders. The quota is landed in Arnold's Cove. It is processed by Newfoundlanders. And I would have to ask Minister Byrne and the head of the union, why would you not support Newfoundland boats with Newfoundland crews landing fish in Newfoundland plants being processed by Newfoundlanders when you allowed for them to sell product outside of Newfoundland and Labrador this year to other provinces and other plants? That is an irony I do not understand, and both the union and the government of Newfoundland and Labrador push for fish to be sold outside of our province, but will not accept their own people fishing the resource, landing it in their own plants, employing their own people, and they are against this 6%. Let me tell you why they're against it. Because until the fishermen went out in the street and thought that maybe we should have done better here, that 6% should have went to the inshore, or that 5% should have went to the inshore. None of these people had any issues with it. They were writing letters pressuring the minister to do just that. So I want to put it on the record, and I want to ask both Minister Byrne and Ms. Street why you would not support offshore cod being landed and processed in Arnold's Cove, giving people there more weeks of work this year than they had in previous years.
Thank you. I'll leave that. I'll leave the answer and leave to President-elect Street to follow, if that's okay. I have to report to the committee that there was an interesting news story done by the Fish Broadcast by Paula Gale. I'll send the transcript through you, Mr. Chair, for distribution. But the president of Ocean Choice International says publicly that and Ocean Choice International, of course, being an enterprise allocation holder for Northern Cod, he said he supports the 115,000 metric ton backstop. So there is an appearance that the government has offered something which was not really wanted. Now, I'll let committee members decide for themselves what exactly that transcript says, but that is what was recorded. The second thing that I will say is that the Labrador Shrimp Union Company is one of the most excellent companies I've ever encountered in terms of quality product, treating their people well.
So why would you not want them to have access to the resource?
I often recognize that the Labrador Shrimp Union Company lands their fish in Port Hawkesbury.
You're out of time to ask a question.
So thank you for the protection, Mr. Chair, as we say. I often remark that that inshore fishers are the heart and soul of the Labrador Shrimp Union Company. Occasionally, the Labrador Shrimp Union Company lands their shrimp in Port Hawkesbury, Nova Scotia. So there are choices to be made, but we as public stewards have choices that we have to be made as well.
Point of order, Mr. Chair, I want to clarify that the shrimp landed by the shrimp company in Port Hawkesbury is market ready.
Point of order,
Mr.
Chair. The MP's time is up by over a minute.
So
it is up. If anything you haven't said in an answer, again, you can submit in writing, please. I want to get to Mr. Arnold before we finish up for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to go back to Mr. Burns for a few minutes, if we can. Minister, can you tell us why the CCFAM meeting went so poorly, that it wasn't even able to produce a joint communique? You touched on that briefly, but it sounds like trust has been lost in not just the department, in the minister, in the Prime Minister's decisions on fisheries management. We've gone through 5 ministers. We're now on number 6, and embroiled in this turmoil over the northern cod fishery and her decision, which has gone counter to her bosses, the Prime Minister's decision. We have fisheries and aquaculture ministers from across the country that have spoken out about the displeasure that they sensed around that meeting. So can you tell us why it went so poorly?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. we always live in hope that the moments that we experience can be turned around and things could get better. That was a very, very difficult meeting for all participants. I think it turned out to be a very difficult meeting for the federal minister in the end. I know that in Nova Scotia, the Minister Kent Smith, he expressed frustrations because he wanted to talk about illegal and unreported catch. That was not put on the agenda. I wanted to talk about many things, including Gulf redfish, Gulf shrimp, northern cod, and some other matters. But I really, really also wanted to talk about the solutions to all of the above, which was joint management. That was not allowed to be on the agenda. It was the first time ever, Mr. Chair, that the federal minister acted in a unilateral basis to decide the agenda. We are a group of equals, the 14 of us. That's the way the system, that's the way the structure of the Canadian Council for Fisheries and Aquaculture Ministers have always worked. We're a group of equals. That day we were not. The federal minister had the final say.
Thank you, Minister. I want to move on now to Dr. Carruthers. You spoke about lessons learned and lessons forgotten in your opening remarks. And I'm going to quote another couple of recommendations from this committee's 2017 report, a unanimous report, as Mr. Burns identified. This committee has worked and produced so many unanimous reports over the years, all parties in agreement. Recommendation number 8 was that Fisheries and Oceans Canada immediately create a rebuilding plan for northern cod stock, and then goes on through 5 bullet points of what should be done. Recommendation number 9 was that Fisheries and Oceans Canada implement management practices that deliver the greatest value from the resource with the lowest impact on stocks. Ms. Carruthers, would you say that this government has followed through on unanimous recommendations from this committee?
No. And one of the things that I think is being lost in this discussion is that fishing on pre-spawning, winter aggregations, and spawning aggregations is a high-risk activity. It assumes that that you have more than one spawning aggregation that recovers. It assumes that you have your stock assessment correct, and it's just a much higher risk situation because the sexually mature fish are all packed together, and that is one of the pieces that has been missed today, is talking about what a high risk way of fishing that is.
Okay.
So to answer your question bluntly, no.
Okay, briefly, is the new commercial fishery that was announced this year affecting those winter and spawning stocks, do you believe? Is it extending into those seasons?
I just saw that the season is to extend, I believe, until April 15th of next year. So the answer is yes.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. There's 5 seconds left.
I'm so generous with my time.
You were. Thank you. We'll now go to Ms. Thompson for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you. Mr. Byrne, if I could ask you quickly, are you familiar with the consulting firm, the Focus Group?
Mr. Chair, no, I'm not.
So interesting. It is a firm owned by a former Conservative member from Newfoundland and Labrador, and this person is currently employed by the Conservative Party of Canada, Steve Kent. And what I find interesting, Mr. Chair, is that our colleague, Mr. Small, has made 12 payments for a total of $16,800 to this gentleman from his House of Commons budget. Now, Mr.
Relevance to this committee?
Getting there.
I mean, it could be a conversation. That's right. It's my time. It could be a conversation. Thank you. It could be, could have been related to cod. But I do find it stressful that public funds are being divert it to a person who works for the Conservative Party of Canada in a partisan role. He's the senior Atlantic desk. I would like, Mr. Chair, to table with the clerk the expenses for Mr. Small's office, screenshots of Mr. Kent's LinkedIn profile, to confirm his ownership of the firm in question,
Point of order, Chair.
and his employment status with the Conservative
order,
Party
Chair.
of Canada.
Again, it goes back to relevance. When the first issue of relevance came up, the comment back was, well, maybe it has something to do with COD. This has nothing to do with the study. This is purely a attack on another member. Is reprehensible, and again, has nothing to do with the study. And members have admitted that maybe it could have something to do with COD. It has nothing to do with COD, nothing to do with the study today.
Yeah, and we don't know
roll on
that,
the
but
relevance, please.
the members' time is her time, whether it's a question or a statement she's making. If
And
it's relevant to the study, it'll be entered into the study. If it's not, it won't show up
Relevance.
in the study.
And thank you for that, Mr. Chair, and certainly Mr. McCauley. I've seen similar things from you in the past in other committees.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I will bring that up, that I don't want to use unparliamentary language, but the member opposite knows that it's not true, and it's shameful her
No point of
to
order, Mr. Chair.
push away from her actions
No
by
point of
pushing
order,
such
Mr. Chair.
comments
It's
against
debate.
myself.
It's no point of order.
I would ask members to keep comments to what we're studying or doing here in committee, please.
So I will move there quickly. Then I would like to put the following motion on notice. I move that the Standing Committee on Fishery and Oceans condemn the corrupt misuse of public funds for partisan purposes, and that the committee refer the specific matter relating to Mr. Small and Mr. Kent to the Office of the Ethics Commissioner for a priority review.
Okay.
Yes.
Vote done now? Oh, okay, okay,
Thank you.
all right. Okay, we'll now go to Madame Debienne for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Mon Dieu, Monsieur le Président, il y a de l'action.
Wow, it's really heating up here at this committee meeting. Something quite different from what we usually see here. Using time to make statements. Let me just take advantage of this to inform our witnesses here today that in Quebec, that some thinking is underway in Quebec following decisions by the DFO. Decisions taken in recent years. We have to make some important decisions. We may be an independent country, but before then, we'll have to find a route to right our trajectory, to correct decisions taken by this government that have affected Quebec harvesters, shrimp harvesters have not. Mackerel can't be fished, whereas Americans are fishing away. And there's also been changes caused by climate change. It's difficult for us to adapt because we have no powers based on what we understand to be going on. Everything is done by the federal government, which is not listening to actors on the ground. We experience this on an ongoing basis in Quebec, but I understand now that other provinces have the same experience. So I have a major question to ask here. Within the framework of this study that has more to do with Newfoundland and Labrador than Quebec, but nonetheless, we remain concerned by cod biomass, even though we're told that the cod, their DNA is different and that there's no impact on other types of cod. Nonetheless, there are scientists who tell us the exact opposite. It's a bit hard to decipher. In relation to this, my sincere hope is that this study will cast some light on the fact that once again there are major fault lines, major loopholes when it comes to communication between what's going on the ground and the government, between the different harvesters organizations, between scientists, who's understanding, who's reading, and in my opinion, and the opinion of many people, their voices are excluded, are neglected, whereas we should all have an interest in listening to what scientists are telling us, to listening to what fish harvesters are telling us.
And by half a minute.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
I want to
Thank you.
the last 2.5 minutes to Ms. Barron. When you're ready, please.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I forgot to say congratulations to Ms. Street on your new position. And I just wanted to acknowledge that and say that I'm very excited about the opportunity to work further with you down the road through the chair. With that, we have gotten off topic quite a bit this meeting, and I want to offer the remainder of my time. I have questions that I can ask you, but instead I want to open up the floor to the mic to you, Ms. Street, for you to be able to offer any final thoughts that you have for us that we should be considering in our final recommendations to the government.
Absolutely, and thank you, Chair. I guess I'll leave my last statements to be related to something Ms. Jones asked earlier, and I didn't have time to respond to. And that's, there were a couple of tangents there. I'm not quite sure how they meshed together. It was very confusing. And the insinuation somehow that we don't support this fish being landed to plants like Icewater and Arnold's Cove, which of course those plant workers are actually our members. We fully support the first 115,000 metric tons of this fish being landed to Arnold's Cove, to the shrimp company in Labrador. I mean, the shrimp company does absolutely fantastic work and is the engine of their community. But we need to do it sustainably, and we need to do it with conservation in mind, and we need to do it in the ways that our members, our owner-operator, inshore harvesters have been nursing this stock back since the moratorium. And to do that, we use passive gears. Mobile gears hunt fish, and I've heard Dr. Rose say this. Mobile gears, bottom trawls, are not selective, and what you get is what you get. What our harvesters fish, whether it's gillnet, whether it's longline, we have harvesters who have invested in longline systems, hook and line systems for fall fisheries to extend that fishery into the fall and create longer employment like we discussed earlier. But we need to do it sustainably. And if we do that, this stock is going to support our members in Arnold's Cove. It's going to support the plant workers in every other plant where cod is processed. But if we are going to allow technologies onto this stock right now when it's in vulnerable states and the tech is so low, then we're just going to wind up back to when I was 10 years old and I saw the small fish floating on the water in Port Union, and I saw what those draggers brought in, and I heard what those draggers brought in, and I saw that plant empty, and I saw houses empty and my friends leave to go to Alberta, never to come back. And I saw communities absolutely devastated. So we support those plants and those workers, but we need to make sure that what we're doing makes sense. And what the Liberal government has done here makes zero sense. And Ms. Jones should know, because there has been no fanfare for this decision. It was not the political win that they keep trying to defend and keep trying to claim it was. And if they are actually listening, the Liberal government will know that there is backlash and there's a lot of it, and it's very volatile right now. But for some reason, the message is not getting through.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Barron. That concludes our rounds of questioning, and I just want to say thank you to our witnesses, the Honourable Jerry Byrne, of course, from Newfoundland and Labrador, and as well to Dr. Rose and Dr. Crothers, and to Ms. Street as the newly elected president of FFAW. But I was reminded just a few seconds ago that somebody showed me something on a desk one time, and it was a wooden plaque kind of thing, and it said, sometimes the best man for a job is a woman. So hopefully you live up to that and show them that you're much better than any man that's been at it in the past. So again, all the best. I want to thank our members for participating in this evening, but we have a few minutes now. We have to look at the version 2 or something of the study we just did. So we'll allow our witnesses to sign off, and we'll continue on with a bit of committee business.